Hi there. On a hot and humid day here in Chicago, welcome to Truth in Accounting's cool Ask the Experts webinar. Thanks also to the Union League of Chicago for co-sponsoring our event today. Today's topic is public sector pension reform. We're going to discuss whether public sector pensions should follow private sector rules. My name is Bill Bergman. I'm the Director of Research for Truth in Accounting. We're a nonprofit dedicated to helping citizens understand their government and their government's finances with a view to promoting truthful financial reporting. You can learn more about us at www.truthinaccounting.org. And at that place, you can also sign up for our daily morning call newsletter, which compiles government financial news every day. We also offer our Data Z website at www.dataz.org, data-z.org, where you can create charts for all 50 states, 75 largest cities, and the federal government on a wide variety of more than 700 data series of economic, demographic, financial, and Truth in Accounting's proprietary metrics for measuring government financial conditions. Today's event, though, is based on an article co-authored by our two experts on a potential deal for state pension reform. The article dives into the 1974 Employee Retirement Income Security Act, which is also called ERISA. We're going to let our two experts get into that in more detail. Our experts today, well, we're honored today to have Andrew Biggs as one of our experts. Andrew's a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where he pursues policy research on Social Security reform, state and local government pensions, and public sector pay and benefits more generally. In 2013, Biggs served as vice chair of a blue ribbon panel that was tasked with analyzing public pension plan funding. In 2016, speaking of troubled jurisdictions, he was appointed by President Obama to be a member of the boards overseeing reforms to Puerto Rico's finances and pensions. Most recently, he completed an analysis of Connecticut's government pensions together with Tracy Miller of the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. They were looking at the risk and the investments in the plan and associated management and public communication issues about those risks. Joining Andrew and I today is Truth in Accounting's founder and CEO, Sheila Weinberg. Sheila is a certified public accountant, a CPA, and has led Truth in Accounting's initiative since 2002 when she founded our organization. Her commentary on the federal budget, Social Security, Medicare, and other national issues has appeared repeatedly in lots of publications, including USA Today, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal. For today's event, everyone's going to have a chance to ask a question via the Q&A feature, which is not the chat feature, at the bottom of the Zoom menu. If you look down towards the bottom of your screen and hover your mouse over the bottom, you'll see a panel with the Q&A. Just type your question in there in that box anytime during the webinar today, and we'll try to get to it. We may not get to all the questions, though. We've got more than 100 people signed up, so we'll do our best for you, though. First, I'm going to turn it over to Sheila and then to Andrew for some initial comments, and then we'll get into the questions. Sheila?
Thanks so much, Bill. Yeah, and if everybody, we don't get to your questions, feel free to reach out to us afterwards, and we'll be happy to discuss it then. Earlier this summer, we were working with that Truth in Accounting. We were working with different think tanks to try to figure out if the federal government provides additional federal aid to the states, what strings should be attached to it. And I started thinking about the poorly funded pension plans of state and local governments, and just thought, well, could we tie additional federal aid to that? At Truth in Accounting, we've found that the states only have 65 cents set aside for every dollar of pension benefits promised, and the 75 most populated cities, that's only 71 cents set aside for every dollar promised. So something needs to be done with the public pension plans. I thought of my CPA experience and thought of ERISA, which, as Bill said, was passed in the 1970s when the Congress felt that the corporations were, promising these benefits but not setting enough money aside. If a corporation ran into financial trouble, as some were doing in the 1970s, they just left their pensioners high and dry after the employees were counting on those for years. I had also studied ERISA when we were looking for a grading scale of our pension plans, our public pension plans. In ERISA, a corporation is considered endangered if it has a funding ratio of 80% or less. And a corporation has to do immediate action to rectify that situation. So this is the basis of our grading system on our data-z.org website. If a pension plan has less than 80% funding, then we give it a C. Now, I knew enough about ERISA just to be dangerous. I didn't know enough about it to decide whether it was a good idea for all the governments to follow ERISA, all those provisions. So I needed an expert, and the best one I could think of was Andrew Biggs. After a long conversation, Andrew and I co-authored an article called "A Potential Deal for State Pension Reform." It provides a history of the private pensions, how employers let employees down when they needed them most, and it highlights that something funny. It requires corporations, if they're going to promise a pension, then they have to actually fund those benefits. Unfortunately, state and local governments were exempt from this law, and the article states why and outlines, but things have changed since then. In the 1970s, pensions were not that big a deal or not that big a part of the budget of most state and local governments, but that has changed big time now. It also outlines conditions that state and local governments would have to follow if they receive federal aid for their pensions. The biggest one would be to bring the pension plans into federal regulation like ERISA. I was honored to co-author this article with Andrew, and I am more than thrilled to have Andrew as our expert today. Thanks for joining us, Andrew.
Well, thank you very much, Sheila. It's a pleasure to be with you, and it was a pleasure to write the article together with you as well. Maybe to roll back a little bit is private sector pensions in the U.S., defined benefit, traditional pensions, which still do exist in the private sector. Those are regulated under this law called ERISA, and it's a federal government law. And it came about because, as you said, employers were not always funding their pensions sufficiently. And if an employer went out of business, the retirees would find there's no money left there for them. And what the federal regulation is trying to address is the incentives for pension sponsors were often very short term. They're thinking the bottom line, they're thinking of their profits every year. When the pension plan, though, is there for the long term. It's to protect retirees, years and decades in the future. So they recognize these incentives often didn't come together to produce a good pension plan. At the time, though, they thought that this didn't really need to apply to state and local government pensions. Partly there was sort of constitutional objections. This is back in the early 70s when we didn't really know whether the federal government could regulate things like state and local pensions. As subsequent Supreme Court rulings, I think, make clear that the federal government could do it. But there's also this view that government was sort of a model employer, that it wasn't subject to those profit-driven incentives that private sector firms have. So we don't have to worry so much that the governments aren't going to be good caretakers, good stewards of their pensions. Now, since then, we've discovered that's not correct. State and local governments are subject to the same sort of short-termism, the same kind of incentives as private firms. They often shortchange their contributions. They promise too much, they fund too little. So today we're faced with issues where state pensions around the country are severely underfunded. If you compare private sector pensions to state and local government pensions, for each dollar of benefits they've promised in the future, private pensions, due to federal regulation, have set aside over twice as much money today to fund those future benefits as the state and local plans. The private pensions are unquestionably better funded, far better funded than the state and local pensions. So this kind of worked into an idea, for me at least, that when we look at potential federal assistance for a state and local pension system. I mean, several months ago, we had the letter from the Illinois Senate president to the state's congressional legislation saying, look, we need some federal money for our pensions. And the question is, if you're to do that, what will you ask in return? I mean, my own view is there's sort of an unconditional bailout of these plans would be very, very bad policy. Because if you give it to Illinois, you're gonna have to give it to Connecticut, to Kentucky, to New Jersey. Everybody's gonna be lining up for that because they were all essentially underfunded. So the question is, what do you ask in return? And my own view is that if it was a mistake for state and local pensions not to be federally regulated from the get-go, what we could ask in return is, if you need some assistance up front to keep your plan from going under, to make your contributions in the near term, okay, we'll try to help you out on that. But what you have to agree to is that over some time frame, you will agree to be regulated under federal rules. And those rules require more conservative investment return assumptions, a lower discount rate specifically. They require you need to get on top of unfunded liabilities more quickly. Private pensions generally do it in 7 years. Public pensions take up to 30 years to do it. If you want federal assistance up front, you have to agree to some glide path to come into sort of adherence with federal guidelines. So it's a bargain there. And so this would give some help in the short term, but try to make things more sustainable in the long term. The ERISA for private sector plans essentially lays out a choice for employers. They say you can run defined benefit pension right, or don't run it at all. And if you don't want to run it at all, you have options. You could offer 401k, which is much less regulated, much less burdensome financially for the employer. But if you're going to offer a traditional pension, you have to do it in a safe and responsible way. Covering state and local pensions under ERISA would give an additional advantage to state governments in that it would give them that choice. In a lot of states like Illinois, like California, you have either laws or constitutional amendments or just legal interpretations that say that if you're a pension sponsor, if you're a government, not only can you not renege on benefits that already have been earned, but you can't even change the terms on which future benefits are earned. That's something which is 100% permissible under ERISA. It happens all the time in the private sector, and there's sort of market incentives not to cut benefits too much. But what a coverage under ERISA would do is federal law preempts state law. And so it would give states like Illinois that option. It would say, you've got to get right with federal regulation. If you can't, though, then you have an option to switch employees to a 401k. So it's giving some assistance, but telling the state, you have to do this in a responsible way. Either do it right or don't do it at all. We're going to give you some of the tools to do that. So the specifics would have to be nailed down, but this strikes me as a reasonable way of helping the states to keep them from going bankrupt, but not just bailing them out and letting them continue these bad practices forever.
All right, well, thanks. We'll move now to some questions. I've got a few, or more than a few, but we'll get to your questions too out there. I'd like to start. We already touched on this, but let's address this question up front. The idea about why were public sector pensions exempted from ERISA in the first place? What went on there politically? Why, and what was the rationale, either stated or unstated, to do that? Andrew, what do you think?
Well, a lot of this is sort of lost in the mists of time. You can go back, and Congress did hold some hearings during that time period on the funding of state and local pension plans. But I think at that point, they were just not considered to be that big a deal, because the idea the state government could go out of business the way a private firm could, that just didn't occur to people. At that point, this was, I'm pulling a blank of the name of the Supreme Court ruling, but there was a Supreme Court ruling, I think around 1980, which ruled that the federal government could regulate states as employers. Today the federal government regulates minimum wages for states. It does, ACA, OSHA regulations. But prior to 1980 or so, it wasn't clear constitutionally whether they could do that. So I think there was some concern of, can the federal government force states to regulate their pensions? And third, I think it was just a heavier political lift. That Congress is always about the art of the possible. And if you say we have something we don't really see as super important, why have the fight over it? But I think the biggest issue is they just didn't think that states would be sort of irresponsible the way they've turned out to be. It's Illinois is obviously the poster boy, the perennial bad actor. But all around the pension world, for example, you see them taking increasing amounts of investment risk. even at a time when their participants, the workers and retirees, are getting older and older. It's completely contrary to how a pension should be run, but they're doing it because they're desperate. And once you get large sort of financial entities operating out of desperation, that's a good rationale for regulation, just by that alone. But I think there was just not the idea back then that states really needed it. In retrospect, clearly they did.
Yeah, and I think that the state and local governments at that point also were not offering pensions that much. It wasn't a big part of their compensation packages at that point in time either, so that they didn't feel there was need for regulation of something so small part of a state and local government's budgets.
If you go back to the 1970s, the average state and local government pension fund was equal to about 50% of the state and local government's annual budgets. Today, they're equal to somewhere north of 150%. What that means, though, is for any given, let's say you lose 10% on your fund, and the government has to make up that loss, because with the traditional pension, the government bears all that risk. What that means is that the relative impact on the budget today for state and local governments is 3 times bigger than it was back in the 70s, because the funds are so much bigger. And moreover, they're taking so much more investment risk today than they did in the past. The chance of a big investment loss has grown. So they're really it's a very different animal today than it was when these pension plans were very small, as Sheila said. And when they invest in corporate paper annuities, in corporate bonds, today you have CalPERS out in California essentially saying we're going to borrow an additional 20% of money in order to buy private equity. They're in essence, they are going to be 100% stocks. I mean, if you think of the risk profile, it would be 100% stocks. Nobody thinks that's a responsible portfolio, but that's kind of the box they've gotten themselves into. So it's just a very different animal today.
Well, speaking of risk, my next question is, where does the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation fit in all of this? Are we possibly facing a future that has happened in the past with respect to the savings and loan industry and the FSLIC?
Well, the PBJC was set up as part of ERISA. It provides limited insurance for beneficiaries, for retirees' benefits in case their plan becomes insolvent. So there are limits on how much you can get, but most retirees will have their benefits fully covered. It's based on the size of your benefit, the age at which you retired. The PBGC multi-employer plan is in trouble because multi-employer pensions, these are sort of kind of union affiliated pensions that cover broad industries. Those are in bad shape. The single employer side for PBGC is not terribly funded. I think if you were to cover public sector pensions under ERISA, you'd probably want to set up a third component, which would be dedicated to public plans. The plans would have to make insurance contributions to PBGC to fund it. The way I see it is you wouldn't get PBGC protection immediately. You would get PBGC protection for your benefits once you became compliant with ERISA standards. You don't want to have a situation where you say, we're going to cover you under ERISA. The next day, the plan goes bankrupt and says we want PBGC protection. That just becomes a bailout. But I think part of the deal would be, if over say 10 years, you pay these premiums and you become compliant with ERISA standards for funding, for discount rates, et cetera, then your participants become eligible for PBGC protection. So it's, the idea here is to get some kind of deal that is good enough that the state and local governments would want to take it. They see some advantage for themselves, but also something which puts these plans on a solid footing going forward, or gives options to switch to an alternate plan. So it's it's not a perfect situation, but it's recognizing we're in a mess because of past bad decisions made by Congress on the regulatory side, but foremost by the managers of these plans themselves.
Are you effectively, with this grand bargain, are we at the end of the day, you mentioned this is maybe not the best solution. Are we effectively bailing out these plans with this new federal role? If that's true, why should taxpayers in relatively sound states, and that relates to one of our audience questions that I'm going to ask next. Why should the taxpayers in places that have been soundly managed bail out the plans from irresponsible jurisdictions?
Well, I'll just give my point of view, Sheila, and I'll give hers. My own point, there's two ways to look at this. Is you would be 100% justified in just saying no to a state that came looking for pension system. If Illinois says we need assistance for our pension plans, the federal government, we totally justified saying, look, for decades you haven't paid your contributions, you haven't done the reforms you need to do. Tough, just go live with it. Part of my change of view on things, though, has come from my experience with the bankruptcy in Puerto Rico. For the last 4 years, I've been on the oversight board dealing with that. The bankruptcy of a sort of a state level entity. I mean, Puerto Rico's 3 million people. The bankruptcy at that level is an extremely difficult thing to get yourself out of. It is very economically disruptive and you push your state into recession. And as a result of some of the economic downturn in Puerto Rico, the federal government's obligations for things like Medicaid, for TANF, for food stamps, those have gone up because the need has grown. If a state like Illinois were to go into bankruptcy, being pushed essentially by the pensions, that has economic repercussions which affect the federal government, which will affect other states. So my own view is, to the degree these are pension problems, that you're going to look at state level bankruptcy because of the pensions, maybe we can deal with the pension by itself and try to prevent this larger problem. It's easy to say, just tell them to go jump. They made their bed, let them sleep in it. But in reality, this ends up being a much messier problem, and a lot of people get hurt and a lot of costs are incurred other than those, other than the people who caused the problem in the first place. So it's just trying to get ahead of it a little bit.
Yeah, and in the article we mentioned, there are private sector multi-employer plans that are struggling, and Congress is really considering, funding those. And then, for example, let's say Illinois' largest pension plan is the teachers' pension plan, and is the federal government going to, let that plan where those teachers not have that income that they have been promised? And as Andrew mentioned, let's just say they say no, then they go on Medicaid, they need other financial resources from the federal government also. And then you could, some people could say, the infamous, you bailed out the banks, why wouldn't you bail out these, state and local governments? Unfortunately, Congress has become the last resort in bailing out all these different entities. So I think it's better to, catch it now before it gets a total disaster, provide some money instead of having to provide even more money in the future.
Your observation, Sheila, on the resolution of the crisis in 2008, 2009, I'm afraid is part of the mix here. We're dealing with the costs of that disaster that are not just direct, but also indirect, in the sense that people are pointing to that experience. Well, you bailed out the banks. Why you should be bailing out the public sector pensions too. And that's another way that the cost of the 2008, 2009 crisis is still with us today. Here's a good question relating to the the last question. It's from an audience member. Is there any state that manages a defined benefit plan well? If so, how and why? What can we learn from them? And in turn, anybody leading the way on getting closer to defined contribution pensions out there that's worthy of looking at?
One thing to think about. I mean, you will find states that report their funding as being essentially 100% or close to it. Wisconsin is there. The state of Washington is well-funded pensions. The important thing to remember, though, is that public sector pensions operate under a set of accounting rules which are much, much more forgiving than what private sector pensions operate under. And a lot of this comes to the discount rate that is used to calculate what we call the present value of the future benefits you owe. Private sector pensions, by law under ERISA, use around a 4% discount rate. It's based on corporate bonds. It's actually less than that now. Right now, it's a little, about 2.8% they're using. Public sector pensions use about a 7.5% discount rate. It's a completely different measure of what you're getting. So a plan that was 100% funded using a 7.5% discount rate, say Wisconsin's or wherever, they're probably 60% funded using the federal standards for private sector pensions. A good source of information on this is the Bureau of Economic Analysis, a federal agency that does the national income and product accounts. You can find for each state measures of assets and liabilities, where the liabilities are measured using a corporate bond yield. And they do this because the national account standards, which are agreed upon between different countries, or how do we represent assets and liabilities and income correctly, they state that you should use a more conservative discount rate to value these liabilities. So you can say, Wisconsin is not, by private pension standards, is not a particularly well-funded state. I mean, it would be in trouble. But the difference is, though, they are at least trying to make their contributions each year. They're not playing, well, they've done a pension obligation bond, but by and large, they're not playing tricks to avoid paying what their own rules tell them to do, versus your Illinois or whoever who are trying to avoid even playing by the lax standards they're set by. A state like Utah has done reforms in the past 10 years. They limit the amount that the state will have to contribute. If costs go higher, employees have to pay more. Wisconsin itself has a variable cost of living adjustment, so they only pay the COLAs when they can afford it. Michigan has defined contribution plans, Alaska does. But a key thing to remember is, if you were to look at these states by private pension standards, or for that matter, the standards that public sector plans in other countries use, Canada or the UK or wherever, none of these states look particularly well funded. But there are plans that are, or states that are trying hard to do it right, and then there's the bad actors that have just kicked the can down the road.
Here's one from Scott Shepard, an audience member. Andrew, would you require retirees in bailed out states to take haircuts before any bailout happens?
As written, no. And the idea there is, because a lot of these states are not insolvent at present, but the idea is, if you bring them under ERISA, what it states is that not only funding standards, but ERISA also sets up via the PBJC a formula by which benefits would be cut if a plan became insolvent. The Puerto Rico experience for me is this huge ongoing fight over whether we should have benefit cuts, how big they should be, who they should apply to. I think there's kind of an elegance or an ease of use of saying, let's just apply the same standards that the PBJC applies if a private plan becomes insolvent, where you are covered up to a certain limit based on when you retire, the age you retire, the year in which you retire. So I don't think you would require benefit cuts up front. And it would be a deal stopper for something like this. I'm trying to get something done, not just trying to sort of set up a position. And I think it just requiring that upfront will be a stopper for any state to agree to it. But if they do become insolvent, there's then a formula which is just set in law, applies to everybody, and says, here's how it works. So nothing upfront, but down the line, we have an idea of how this would work.
Yeah, and I like the ERISA. I like the ERISA provisions where if it becomes 80% funding or less, then they have to immediately set up a plan for action to help the funding. And if it becomes 65% or less, then there are set things that have to be done. Benefits have to be cut, contributions have to be increased. So it establishes set rules on when action needs to be taken, instead of under the current system, we're just, in essence, the bad plans, we're just waiting for them to fail. There's no intermediate action that has to be taken. The federal government might come in when immediate action is, the federal government's going to have to come in when, everything is a crisis, instead of having a plan as we go along.
In banking, we've learned that prompt corrective action is an important thing to be thinking about in managing, and whether or not we're past that point for a number of jurisdictions is an important question. Regarding the federal regulatory role in your proposal going down the road, I have a question. What possible role could or should the federal government have in addressing the risk in these plans? Should that be part of the federal mix?
Under ERISA, that is essentially not, the federal law doesn't dictate how a pension plan can invest. When sometimes people hear, well, federal law says you need to use a low discount rate for your liabilities, they say, but we're investing in assets that have a higher expected return. So there isn't a limitation on what you can invest in. But changing these discount rate rules would remove a big incentive that states have to take more and more investment risk. The higher the discount rate you assume, the lower the present value of your pension liabilities, the lower the contribution you can make today. Now, with private plans under ERISA, that discount rate is essentially set. It's going to be the corporate bond yield regardless of how you invest. But with state and local pensions, they work under GASB rules, Government Accounting Standards Board. The discount rate there is set based on the expected return of the plan's assets. What that means is if you take more and more risk with your investments, you have a higher expected return. That means you can have a higher discount rate, lower present value of your liabilities, lower contribution. What that means is if you take more risk with your investments, you immediately credit yourself with those higher returns. You immediately make a lower return or lower contribution to your plan. With private pensions, you can take investment risk, and if that investment risk pays off, your funded ratio improves, your contributions will drop. But you only credit yourself with the extra return after you've received it. The interesting thing with state and local pensions, there's been various work looking at this, is they're taking more and more investment risk. They are investment risk leaders in the pension world, even at a time when US private sector plans and pensions in other countries are taking less investment risk. So what we need to do is remove the incentive for taking excessive risk, which is clearly having an effect on US public sector plans. And in a sense, that will help nudge them towards more responsible investment practices.
Yeah, Andrew, I was surprised when I first got into public pensions. I just assumed that the actuaries, the experts there, set the all the assumptions, but I'm finding more and more that others are doing that, not those professionals who are setting all those the assumptions that they use.
I was on the Society of Actuaries Blue Ribbon panel on pensions, and one thing we talked about there was how this puts the actuarial firms in a squeeze, in a sense that the states, for the most part, contract out to private firms. They want actuaries who are going to sign off on more forgiving assumptions, whether it comes to investment returns or wage growth or all these other things, that it's going to make life easier on them. The actuaries are trying to do the right thing, but they also know if they push too far, some other actuarial firm might come in and undercut them. Some are known for being more forgiving on these things than others. Again, that's a case where regulation makes sense, so that you don't have pressure on the actuaries to sign off on things that they really don't want to sign off. And I've talked to actuaries who will tell you, I'll sign off on this return, 7.5%, 8%, even if I personally think a 6% return is more appropriate. The difference between a 6 and an 8% discount rate is probably 40 percentage points in your funding ratio. So they're signing off on things they shouldn't have to do. That's why you need regulation. The actuarial profession through the Actuarial Standards Board is looking at that, but something that protects the actuaries from all these pressures to act irresponsibly.
Yeah, we have an actuary here in the state of Illinois who is very generous with his assumptions. He ran over, he was the actuary for over 200 plans. Used very generous investment rate of returns, discount rates, and other actuaries tried to get into that business. We're competing against him for business, but when he offered these very generous assumptions, he got the work. Unfortunately, or fortunately, he was finally sanctioned by the Actuary Society and lost that work. And some of the, these small government pension plans, they're funded ratio, the amount that they were unfunded just dramatically increased as they had to use more updated mortality schedules and a better discount rate. So, these you do have some bad actors, even in actuaries. But then again, the huge pressure from governments to, use what they consider the right assumptions to lower their discount, to lower their contributions, is not, I don't think, the right way to go. And regulation, federal regulation might help you.
Yeah, if this were going on in the private sector, people would call out for regulation, where you're essentially sort of venue shopping for a scorekeeper who's going to give you the most advantageous rules, even if it puts your benefits at greater risk in the future. I mean, these are the incentives that regulation is designed to deal with. And those incentives exist in the private sector. We regulated those pensions. Now, fewer employers today offer defined benefit pensions than in the past, partly because ERISA requires them to actually fund the plan. But if you have pensions out there where they still exist, they are very well funded compared to the public sector plans. So, it gets the idea, if you're going to offer this plan, you have to do it in a responsible way. If you're not going to do it responsibly, if you're going to put your retirees at risk, taxpayers at risk, just don't offer it. I mean, there's ways of offering defined contribution plans, 401ks, 403bs, 457s. If you design a well-run plan there with low cost, automatic enrollment, good investment options, you can provide a very good retirement plan for your employees without putting people at risk this way. So either do it right or don't do it at all.
Here's a sensitive question from an anonymous attendee. That's why it's sensitive. And I'm going to leave the identity of who he was recommending out, but just the question is interesting. I'm trying to guess if this anonymous attendee is either a taxpayer or a pension plan participant. Here's his question. Is there any way to sue past legislators for their pension decisions?
In general, not. There was a Supreme Court case just this past year which dealt with private sector pensions, and it was sort of an ERISA case, but what they were looking at there was suing the trustees this is plan participants, who they said made bad investment decisions, irresponsible investment decisions, that they thought put the plan at risk. It turns out the plan survived, the benefits were paid. Basically, the Supreme Court said you can't do it. It's extremely hard to sue people, hard to hold them responsible for these kinds of choices they make. And your average legislator, elected official has very little idea how these things work. They are really at the mercy of the various stakeholder groups. Obviously, public employees are one of them, but they also hear from the investment advisors who want to get these contracts. And we've seen, New York, California, where you've had problems with that. They hear from the actuaries. So you have a bunch of non-experts whose incentives are all short-term, managing very complex financial programs that have very long-term objectives. It's just, it's surprising we haven't had problems already. It's just set up for disaster, and eventually you get it. But I just don't think you can hold these guys responsible for it. If I were constructing, I thought about this going into it in Puerto Rico, that if we had to do benefit cuts, the elected officials would get the biggest benefit cuts. Really stick it to those guys as a lesson. As it turns out, Puerto Rico had a rule that said elected officials were not required to participate in their pension plan. So I think a lot of them just didn't. They knew which way the wind was blowing. So that didn't turn out, but that might be a way of going after them. That if you have to pass a law to cut benefits, stick it to the elected officials first. If anybody has responsibility for the pension plan, it's them.
Yeah, and we found in Illinois, one of the pensioners did sue one of the plans because they weren't funding it properly. As you know, the benefits are, quote, guaranteed here in Illinois. So he was like, well, shouldn't the funding be guaranteed? And, surprisingly, the courts here in Illinois said, nope, those benefits are guaranteed, but you don't have to fund them. You don't have to contribute to them. So you can promise them, but you don't have to adequately fund them.
Interestingly,
it was setting people up for disaster.
New Jersey had a similar court case where the unions sued and said, you have to fund the pensions. The courts ruled against them and said, look, we owe you the pension, but how we fund it is our business. New York State, on the other hand, the courts ruled, okay, the benefits are guaranteed, and so you have to actually fund them. So New York has had a little bit of games playing with their actuarial methods, but by and large, they've made the contributions. And I think municipal pensions in Illinois are better funded because they're also compelled to contribute. So it's, I can see some of the legal logic of saying, the liability is distinct from how you fund the liability. But the reality is that, what New Jersey tried to do is say, we need to cut pension benefits because we can't afford to pay them. The unions rightly came back and said, well, the reason you can't afford to pay them is because you didn't make the contributions. So it's, you don't want to get yourself into that logic where the state's irresponsibility is used as sort of a legal bludgeon to attack the retirees. It's a complicated issue.
Here's a question from a keen observer out there. It's fun to see Mary Pat Campbell ask a question here. Any difference in results when the private actuaries are doing the actuarial assumptions versus when the actuaries are state employees, as in New York or CalPERS?
Yeah, it's CalPERS has their own state actuarial office. Washington State does. New York does. I know New York City does. New York State, I'm less sure. I don't know whether it makes that much of a difference in the outcomes. I will say I think the actuarial analysis is a lot better. Both California and Washington do a lot of analysis of looking at, they use like Monte Carlo simulations to look at different outcomes given that we're investing in risky assets. Washington has done analysis pointing out that contributions from states, from the sponsor, often falter at precisely the time during economic recession when you need those contributions the most. They've done much more sophisticated stuff than the private firms. Now, some of the private firms say, oh, we can't afford to do this Monte Carlo analysis. That's wrong. This stuff's not hard to do. I've done it. New York City, their actuary for a long time was one of the few who insisted on showing the value of the liabilities using a risk-adjusted discount rate, using a low bond rate to reflect the fact these liabilities are guaranteed. At one point, I argued, okay, that's what you need. You need better disclosure to push the incentives, the information in the right direction. Right now, I'm not sure that that's enough. New York City, I'm not sure they responded to having this better information out there. Since that actuary, Bob North, retired, they have a new actuary who's much more activist, who does a lot of things I don't think are particularly appropriate for a pension actuary. But they simply got rid of that information. They just no longer give it out anymore. So I do think that having government employees as the actuaries actually produces better outcomes because they're free from those financial pressures. But I also don't know whether it's enough to make sure things work. The CalPERS actuaries are a good office, but still the investing side, I think, is completely irresponsible right now.
Yeah, people a lot of times, and you keep on mentioning New York, New York City and New York State, what we find is their pension plans, they don't have that large of an unfunded liability for those and do contribute pretty well to those. But what they did is their retiree healthcare benefits aren't under the same laws and protections. So they have gone ahead and promised for hundreds of billions of dollars of retiree healthcare. And unfortunately, a lot of people pay attention to the pensions. We finally got people to pay attention to that boring topic. But now, but most governments have very large unfunded retiree healthcare liabilities, and those that they don't even hardly pre-fund those at all.
If you, I can make a broad sweeping statement here. If you look at the state and local level where pensions, retiree healthcare are an increasing part of the budgets, and you look at the federal level where Social Security and Medicare are bigger and bigger parts of the budget, in both these cases, you have these incentives, short-term incentives for legislators, long-term programs for retirees. The whole name of the game is promising benefits without paying for them. This is like the marshmallow test, where your little kid is offered a marshmallow. They say, if you can wait 10 minutes, you get 2 marshmallows. every one of these elected officials would fail it because they care a ton about what happens in the short term and pretty much zero about what happens in the long term. And it's just, it's a mismatch in the incentives and in the managerial capacities of governments to handle this stuff. And I mean, some countries do it well. I mean, you go to Canada, I see the Ontario Teachers Plan. It's a DB teachers plan, similar to, say, Illinois teachers or whatever. They are essentially 100% funded, even today, using 4% discount rate. I mean, it's a completely different operation than what is going on in some of the states here. Partly they have better accounting and funding rules, but partly is just a level of seriousness about the stewardship of these plans. I mean, I've talked to Canadian pension administrators, I talked to the Dutch. These are serious guys. They're not political hacks or anything like that. If you talk, to be frank, to pension trustees in the US for state and local plans, often a lot of them, they kind of believe their own BS. They're like, oh, we can offer a DB plan at half the cost of a DC plan. I'm like, it's stuff that is just propaganda, basically. And it's okay to have propaganda, but the problem is they actually believe it's true. And it's so having just a level of seriousness about the obligations you have is just a key component. It's having a political corporate culture of, this is a really important thing. Let's treat it really importantly. And in too many states around the country, they're not doing that.
Yeah, and that's why we at Truth in Accounting push for what we call fact-based budgeting and accounting, which, as you know, most state and local governments have balanced budget requirements. But as you've mentioned, they go ahead and, promise things now that they don't have to pay until the future. Under this fact-based system, they would have to include, if they offer a promise, they would have to go ahead and calculate in their budget and fund that properly in the current budget, and in order to truly balance their budget, instead of like in Illinois where they balance their budget, but even using under their very generous actuarial assumptions, they're shorting their pension plans by like $4 billion, but their budget's balanced. So we push to, when you quote balance your budget, you have to include not just the short-term information, you have to include the long-term costs that you're incurring.
Here's a question from Stephen Brown. He wants to dig into this discount rate stuff a little bit. What's the justification for having a different discount rate environment in GASB compared to what FASB and or the International Accounting Standards Board has? How do they justify doing this different thing?
Well, the question is how they got to where they are today. If you went back, and I talked about 1970s, at that point, public sector pension plans were investing very conservatively. Their discount rates will be based on those more conservative investments. So, even though there's a theoretical disconnect, the discount rate for a liability, for like a pension liability, should be based on the risk of the liability itself, not the risk or return of any assets used to fund the liability. This is sort of financial economic stuff. This is how financial markets work. So, back in the past, they had this theoretical disconnect, but it just happened that the discount rate on these they used was consistent with what it should be. But as pensions in the public sector took increasing amounts of risk over time, the disconnect between the appropriate discount rate for the liabilities, which are guaranteed, they're very bond-like, and the expected return on their assets, that grew to be very, very large. Now, in the private sector, there's just regulation that states you're going to use a corporate bond yield because sort of a pension payment from a corporation isn't really that different from a future bond payment from a corporation. In both cases, you promise a certain amount of people they're going to get a certain payment at a certain time with a certain level of certainty. They're very similar. What state pensions will tell you now, which is sort of an ex post explanation, they'll claim, well, corporations can go out of business. We can't go out of business yet. And we're long-term investors, blah, blah, blah. They claim it's this sort of stock the long run thing. If you hold stock for a long time, they're not risky, which is false. The interesting thing there is that if you look at public sector pensions in other countries, you go to Canada or Netherlands or wherever, These are governmental plans. They have the same supposed advantages that state and local plans here do, but they use much more conservative assumptions. They're not assuming, or using a 7.5% discount rate for their liabilities. They're using 3%, 4%, some using 2%. So the question isn't just a distinction between public and private. It's what sort of magic do U.S. public sector plans think they have that these public sector plans in other countries don't have. And the reality is there is no magic in any of them. The public sector plans in other countries realize there's no magic, and so they act responsibly. Our guys are still fooling themselves. So it's interesting. The public sector plans themselves use these high discount rates. If you look at Federal Reserve statistics on public sector pensions in the US, they use a corporate bond yield. You look at national income and product accounts data on US public plans, they use a corporate bond yield. Look at Moody's and some of these other bond ratings agencies, they're using a corporate bond yield. We've had, for the past 10 or 15 years, this argument over the discount rates. That argument has basically been won on the side of the people who think we need lower, more conservative discount rates for public pensions because they're offering guaranteed benefits. The problem is the one holdout on that is the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, GASB, and they're the ones who set the rules because they're, to be frank, kind of a captured regulator. I think they're too close to the industry. It's a tough kind of thing, but really the argument has been won. So for people who want to get accurate data on how their states are funding their pensions, go to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which does the national income and product accounts. They have a recent publication giving state level data. If you think your state is well funded, you'll find out your state's really not very well funded. If you think your state's badly funded, you find out your state's terribly funded. So either way, you're in for a surprise. But that is the sort of the most accurate information of how well funded these plans are.
Here's a good follow-up question along these lines from William Holder. Accounting standard setters generally refrain from writing accounting standards which are designed to promote the standard setter's view of, quote, good management, unquote. Should this long-standing premise be abandoned in favor of empowering standard setters to develop standards that include the standard setter's view of promoting good management?
Well, there's accounting standards and then there's sort of funding standards. Say for private pensions, the federal government kind of does both. And I mean, for financial statements, you get sort of your FASB stuff, which is slightly distinct. But the accounting standards say, how do we measure liabilities for a plan? Just as an example. And they'll say, what's the most accurate way of measuring it? And that's distinct from the behavior of the plan managers. But then funding standards say, okay, well, at what point does the government step in if the funding is insufficient? At some point, if the funding is insufficient, based on these accounting standards that we think are accurate, that poses a risk to the participants. It poses a risk to the taxpayer. At that point, the government steps in and says, you have to resolve this. This is like bank management stuff, prompt corrective action. If your capital standards get too low, then you have to do something about it, or you have to merge another bank or shut down or whatever. It's a similar kind of thing, recognizing that these are big financial institutions that are extremely important to a lot of people, but can pose risks to a lot of people. So I think there's a distinct thing. Accounting standards should simply measure as accurately as possible what is going on with a financial institution. But the funding standards are something set by governments that say, we don't want you posing a risk. So if you're going to run a plan, you do it right or you don't do it at all.
Yeah, we find, the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, who, sets the standards, as you mentioned, are captive. Most of them have vested interest. They're, in the accounting standards and what's being reported. The governmental accounting world went crazy recently because they appointed a private sector person as the chairman. Previously, it always had state treasurers or state auditors as the chairman, and the most recent person appointed was actually from a large CPA firm. Now we would go even the opposite of that. He also has a vested interest because he has a lot of clients who are government clients, And if he goes against what those clients want, he might lose business. So is he really, an independent person? And as I say, the other board members are either current or former government officials or municipal bond people. I don't think there's anybody there representing the taxpayers, just like there isn't on the Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board. Nobody representing the taxpayers there. It's all representing the governments or the pensioners.
If I could give you an example, I remember this is probably 10 years ago testifying before GASB when they were holding hearings on pension accounting. But the question I pose is, what happens to the funding health of a pension plan if it shifts its investments from sort of less risky investments to more risky investments? Now, in the private sector, essentially nothing happens. I mean, the funding health of your plan is the function of the value of your investments relative to the value of your liabilities, your assets versus your liabilities. Shifting a dollar from bonds to stocks doesn't change that ratio. But if you're in the public sector, the GASB rules, if you shift from bonds to stocks, you assume a higher rate of return on your investments. That's a higher discount rate that applies to your liabilities. So instantaneously, by taking more investment risk, your liabilities shrink. You instantaneously become better funded. And from that point onward, you can make lower contributions. This is something that just doesn't work in the private sector. The private sector says, well, once your assets grow, you can make lower contributions, but not until then. Public sector says you take more risk, you are instantly better funded. And I raised this when I was testifying before GASB. Nobody really had a response. I'm not even quite sure they understood the point, but it was just, it's a total disconnect of how these guys are working.
Well,
that's pretty scary, given we're all on the downside. We got one more time for one more question, so I'm going to ask two of them actually that are related. One is from an anonymous attendee. Should the California Supreme Court abolish the California rule? What impact would that have? And that relates to the final question, a good one, and it relates to something Andrew brought up earlier. Do you think it's time for the federal law to be changed in order to enable abrogation of previous state level guarantees?
Let me just touch on the California rule quickly. The California Supreme Court just did a very limited ruling on the California rule says, not only can we not cut benefits you've already earned, and that's consistent with federal law for private pension, but it goes beyond federal law and says we cannot change the terms on which you earn future benefits. So from the first day on the job, the formula by which you earn future benefits can't be reduced. I mean, New York has this, it's kind of the de facto rule in a lot of places. The issue is ERISA, when it came in, it strengthened rules and protections for participants in the private sector. It's put in this anti-cutback rule on accrued benefits. You would think that because state and local government doesn't have ERISA, that their protections against these kinds of cuts would be weaker. Instead, the states have said, no, we have this sort of implied contract that goes for life. From the day you step foot on, in a government office, we can't change anything. If you go back to the original legal rulings, I think the judge didn't really understand what was going on. It was a weird case. But the point is that there's no place else where you have these implied contracts where, you can't change terms in the future. And so for the state governments to say there is, I just don't think it really makes sense. I mean, if you have a constitutional provision saying you can't change the terms, that's fine. But just a claim that exists when there's no actual contract there, and when there's no claim of an actual contract anywhere else in the economy, it just seems kind of absurd.
They can increase the benefits, it seems.
That you can change.
They can't decrease them.
I got to reiterate that second question, though. Do you think that the federal law setting up this plan would also be able to excuse states from state constitutional constraints that limit their flexibility?
Yes, and that's part of the idea of covering public pensions under ERISA. Partly it puts in the stricter funding standards, do it right, but it also gives the or don't do it at all option. ERISA, federal law preempts or trumps state law. So if federal law says you state PERS are now federally regulated. If you can't meet these standards, you can shift them to a 401k. You can do that. And so it's the cover them under ERISA. It doesn't just impose financial standards, it also gives them options that they don't really have under current state law. So it gets around those legal roadblocks, which, to be honest, I think any governor in almost any state in their hearts wants to get rid of, but they're just really, really hard to do.
Well, I'd like to thank Andrew and Sheila for joining us today and sharing your insights. We really appreciate, sharing your expertise on a hard topic. It's mission central here at Truth in Accounting to help people try to understand this hard stuff, given how massive the implications are. Thanks to everybody for tuning in, for your questions. We appreciate it. We're sorry we didn't get to all of them. Thanks also to the Union League Club of Chicago for co-sponsoring. Stay safe out there and have a nice day.
Thanks, everybody.